The moon has always looked calm from Earth, like a silent lamp hanging above our nights. It controls our tides, marks our months, lights our oceans, and gives the sky a feeling of balance. But imagine that one evening, astronomers notice something impossible. The moon is no longer staying where it should be. It is falling. Not all at once. It would simply look brighter, larger, almost beautiful. And that is what makes this disaster terrifying, because the end of the world would begin as something people might step outside to admire. Before we imagine the crash, we need to understand why. The moon does not crash into us already. Earth's gravity is always pulling on it, but the moon is not floating, because some invisible force is holding it up. It survives because it is moving sideways fast enough to keep missing Earth. That is what an orbit really is, a continuous fall that never reaches the ground. If you throw a ball, gravity bends its path downward and it lands. But if you could throw that same ball incredibly fast, its fall would curve around the planet. It would keep falling, keep missing, and come back around again. That is the moon's situation on a massive scale. Right now, the moon races around Earth at thousands of kilometers per hour, completing its orbit in roughly 27 days. For it to suddenly stop and drop straight down would break the basic rules of motion. So if we want this nightmare to happen, something has to steal away enough of the moon's orbital speed. In reality, the energy required would be absurd. No machine humanity has ever built, and no army of rockets we could imagine placing across the lunar surface would be enough to push the moon into Earth. Large objects in the solar system remain stable because changing their paths takes almost unimaginable force. So for this documentary thought experiment, we use one impossible event. A sudden cosmic force slows the moon just enough that its orbit begins to decay. It does not fall instantly. Instead, it starts spiraling inward, giving Earth exactly 1 year before impact. That year becomes the longest countdown in human history. Scientists would detect the change within hours. Observatories would confirm it. Governments would try to control panic, but the sky itself would expose the truth. People would look up at the same familiar moon and realize that the object which once guided calendars, oceans, prayers, and love songs had become the greatest threat Earth had ever faced. If you are watching this as a full documentary journey, tell me in the comments what you think humanity would do first. Move inland, build shelters, escape underground, or simply panic. This disaster gets worse in stages, and the most frightening part is that the first signs would not come from fire in the sky, but from water rising where it should not rise. During the first month, life would still feel strangely normal for many people. The moon would appear brighter, and scientists would argue an emergency, but daily routines would continue. The first real warning would arrive through the tides. Tides happen because the moon's gravity pulls on Earth unevenly. The side facing the moon feels a slightly stronger pull than the far side. The oceans respond by bulging. As Earth rotates through these bulges, coastlines experience rising and falling water. This rhythm is predictable. But as the moon moves closer, its pull strengthens, and the oceans begin to behave less like water and more like a weapon being lifted by the sky. At first, the difference would be small. Higher tides, stronger currents, and unusual flooding in places already used to coastal storms. Then the pattern would sharpen. By the end of the first month, the moon could be close enough for tides to rise several meters higher. Low-lying streets would flood twice a day. Seawalls would fail. Subway tunnels, harbors, and waterfront homes would become temporary parts of the ocean. The worst part would be the rhythm. The water would leave, people would rush out to salvage food, medicine, fuel, documents, and loved ones, and then the water would return again, higher than before, turning cities into traps with a schedule. By the beginning of the second month, the crisis would no longer be something discussed on news broadcasts. It would become the reality of everyday life. The moon would now be dramatically closer, and every extra kilometer would strengthen its grip on our planet. Coastal flooding would no longer be an occasional disaster. It would become a permanent cycle. High tides would climb beyond 10 meters in many regions, swallowing neighborhoods that had existed for centuries. Entire coastlines would disappear beneath seawater twice every day, forcing governments to abandon the impossible task of defending every city. Emergency services would shift from rescue to evacuation, and for millions of people, home would become a memory rather than a place. The scale of human migration would be unlike anything in recorded history. Nearly every major port city on Earth would be threatened. Places that once powered global trade would stand silent beneath crashing waves. Families would leave, with only what they could carry, joining endless lines of vehicles moving inland. Airports would be overwhelmed, highways permanently congested, and railway systems pushed far beyond their limits. Temporary refugee camps would quickly become permanent settlements as governments struggled to provide food, medicine, electricity, and clean drinking water. Borders would lose much of their meaning because the disaster would belong to every nation equally. Humanity would not be fighting one another anymore. It would be fighting time. Then another invisible victim would emerge: the global economy. More than 90% of international trade depends on ships moving through oceans. As ports flooded and coastal infrastructure collapsed, container traffic would grind to a halt. Supermarket shelves would begin emptying within weeks. Manufacturing plants thousands of kilometers inland would suddenly stop because the parts they depended on would never arrive. Fuel shortages would spread rapidly as many of the world's largest oil refineries and storage terminals built along coastlines for easy shipping access became inaccessible or completely submerged. Governments would introduce strict rationing systems. Money would still exist, but increasingly, there would be fewer things left to buy. Modern civilization depends on connections that most people never think about until they disappear. Almost all international internet traffic travels through thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cables lying on the ocean floor. While the cables themselves could survive underwater, the stations connecting them to land could not. As coastlines vanished beneath rising tides, communication networks would begin failing, financial markets would lose synchronization, emergency coordination between countries would become increasingly difficult. Satellite phones and military communication systems might continue functioning for a while, but ordinary people would slowly become isolated from the digital world they had built their entire lives around. The internet, once designed to connect humanity, would fracture into disconnected islands. Living far from the sea would provide only temporary comfort. Rivers connected to the oceans would begin behaving in ways that seemed impossible. Massive tidal bores would push seawater upstream with incredible force, reversing the direction of rivers that had flowed the same way for thousands of years. Salt water would spread deep into freshwater systems, contaminating reservoirs, farmland, and underground aquifers. Crops would begin failing long before floodwaters reached them because the soil itself would become poisoned with salt. Communities that believed they were safely inland would discover that the ocean had found another path to them. As the third month began, the disaster would expand beyond Earth's surface and into space itself. Humanity has surrounded the planet, with thousands of satellites responsible for navigation, weather forecasting, banking, communication, military operations. Under normal conditions, the moon is simply too distant to disturb their orbits significantly. Tiny orbital corrections would no longer be enough. Satellite operators would burn through precious fuel, trying desperately to maintain stable positions. But eventually, the mathematics would become impossible to overcome. One after another, satellites would drift away from their intended paths. Some would collide with each other, producing clouds of debris that created even greater dangers. Others would tumble uncontrollably into Earth's atmosphere, burning as brilliant streaks across the night sky. GPS navigation would become unreliable. Aircraft would struggle with positioning systems. Weather forecasts would lose accuracy just as humanity desperately needed them. Military early warning networks would weaken. Financial timing systems would fail, and emergency responders would lose some of the technological tools that modern civilization takes completely for granted. The collapse would not happen in a single dramatic moment. It would happen piece by piece until people realized how dependent they had always been on machines they could never see. Meanwhile, the moon itself would continue growing larger every night. It would dominate the sky with an unsettling brilliance, bright enough that darkness would almost disappear. Nights would no longer feel like nights. Moonlight would cast shadows sharp enough to read by. Sleep cycles across the world would be disrupted as the natural rhythm of day and night slowly disappeared beneath the glow of our approaching neighbor. Ancient myths and religious prophecies would return to public conversation. Social media, where it still functioned, would overflow with fear, conspiracy theories, desperate prayers, and videos of an enormous moon filling the horizon. For the first time in human history, every person on Earth would share the same terrifying realization. Every time they looked upward, the sky itself was changing, and there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it. By the 4th and 5th months, the oceans would become almost unrecognizable. At low tide, the sea would retreat hundreds of kilometers, exposing enormous stretches of the continental shelf that had remained hidden beneath water for millions of years. Shipwrecks, underwater canyons, coral reefs, pipelines, and forgotten landscapes would briefly emerge into the open air before disappearing again beneath walls of returning water. Then, hours later, tides dozens of meters high would race back across the exposed seabed, carrying unimaginable energy toward the continents. Entire forests, highways, farms, factories, apartment towers, and cities would vanish beneath moving mountains of water. Humanity would finally understand that the oceans were no longer following the rules we had always known. By the middle of the 5th month, something even more frightening would begin to happen. Up until now, the oceans had absorbed most of the moon's increasing gravitational pull. Water is fluid. It can flow, rise, and spread out, temporarily relieving enormous amounts of stress. But Earth's oceans have limits. On average, they are only a few kilometers deep. And once the tides reach their maximum possible movement, the moon's gravity has nowhere else to release its energy. The forces that had been moving the seas would now begin squeezing the planet itself. Humanity would realize that the apocalypse had only been warming up. The real victim was never going to be the oceans. It was always going to be the Earth beneath our feet. Imagine holding a rubber ball in both hands and squeezing it repeatedly. At first, it changes shape slightly before that turning to normal. Now replace that rubber ball with an entire planet made of solid rock. The Earth may appear rigid, but under enough gravitational stress, even continents flex. As the moon spirals closer, our planet would begin stretching and compressing by measurable amounts every single day. Combined with the unimaginable weight of trillions upon trillions of tons of seawater shifting back and forth across the crust, the pressure on Earth's tectonic plates would become overwhelming. Geological faults that had remained locked for centuries would suddenly slip. The ground would no longer feel permanent. It would become another restless ocean, only one made of stone. Earthquakes would begin increasing in both frequency and intensity across the globe. Regions with long histories of seismic activity would experience almost continuous shaking. But even places considered geologically stable would no longer be safe. Buildings designed to survive one devastating earthquake would face another a few days later, and then another after that. Rescue teams would struggle to reach trapped survivors because roads, bridges, airports, and railways would constantly be destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Entire mountain ranges would become unstable. Massive landslides would bury valleys without warning. Deep cracks would tear through cities, swallowing roads, neighborhoods, and critical infrastructure. There would no longer be a place on Earth that truly deserved to be called safe. Below the surface, another ticking time bomb would awaken. The immense squeezing of Earth's crust would disturb enormous reservoirs of molten rock hidden beneath volcanoes around the world. Many volcanoes that had slept peacefully for thousands of years would suddenly come back to life. Others already active would erupt, with far greater violence than anything witnessed in modern history. Massive eruptions could occur across the Pacific Ring of Fire, the Andes, New Zealand, Indonesia, Iceland, the Mediterranean, and North America. Even volcanic systems such as Yellowstone would face pressures unlike anything in recorded human history. Predicting exactly which volcano would erupt first would be impossible because the entire planet would be under stress simultaneously. These eruptions would not simply destroy nearby towns. They would reshape Earth's climate, Millions of tons of volcanic ash and sulfur-rich aerosols would blast into the upper atmosphere, spreading around the globe within weeks. The sunlight reaching Earth's surface would become weaker, filtered through layers of microscopic particles, suspended high above the clouds. Days would grow strangely dim, while sunsets turned deep crimson and orange across every continent. Temperatures would begin falling rapidly despite the fires raging below. Crops already weakened by flooding and saltwater contamination now struggle beneath colder skies and reduced sunlight. Farmers would watch entire harvests fail as seasons lost their familiar rhythm. Meanwhile, the moon would continue its silent approach. Even after everything humanity had endured, it would still appear deceptively calm. Hanging in the sky like an enormous lantern, it would now shine bright enough to transform midnight into permanent twilight. Stars that had inspired explorers, sailors, and dreamers for thousands of years would slowly disappear behind its overwhelming glow. Children born during these final months might never experience a truly dark night. Every evening, people would step outside, not to admire the moon, but to measure its terrifying growth. It would seem less like an object orbiting Earth and more like another world slowly descending toward us. Around the 6th month, the moon would cross into the region of space once occupied by geostationary satellites, the spacecraft that normally remain fixed above one point on Earth's equator. Something remarkable would happen. From many locations on Earth, the moon would appear almost motionless in the sky. Instead of rising in the east and setting in the west, it would seem frozen overhead, endlessly watching the same half of the planet. Yet despite standing still, it would still cycle through all of its phases every 24 hours, because its relationship with the sun would continue changing. It would become the strangest object humanity had ever observed, a giant celestial eye, staring at one hemisphere while remaining invisible to the other. The tides would also undergo a dramatic transformation. Instead of endlessly sweeping around the globe, they would appear frozen in place. One side of Earth would remain buried, beneath enormous oceans, while the opposite side would temporarily reclaim much of its exposed land. It would feel as though the entire planet had stopped breathing. Coastlines would lose their familiar rhythm, replaced by an unnatural stillness that seemed even more disturbing than the violent floods that came before. Survivors would realize they were living through a pause between disasters, a brief moment of silence before physics delivered its final blow. Some people might wonder whether the moon's gravity would eventually become so powerful that humans would simply be lifted off the ground. Surprisingly, that would never happen. Earth's gravity is roughly 6 times stronger than the moon's at its surface. Even if the moon hovered directly overhead, you would remain firmly planted on Earth. The real victim would not be humanity's bodies, but the moon itself. As it ventured deeper into Earth's gravitational field, the side facing our planet would begin feeling a much stronger pull than the far side. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the moon would start changing shape. What had been nearly spherical for billions of years would begin stretching into something resembling a gigantic egg. Deep fractures would spread through its crust. Powerful moonquakes would ripple across its surface as entire mountain ranges shifted beneath overwhelming tidal forces. The destruction of the moon had quietly begun, and with it, the final chapter of Earth's greatest catastrophe was drawing closer than ever before. As the 8th month approached, there would be little doubt left about humanity's future. Civilization, as we once understood it, would already be gone. What remained would be scattered pockets of survivors living beneath darkened skies. As the 9th month approached, the moon would cross a boundary that no natural satellite is meant to survive. This invisible threshold is known as the Roche limit, the point where a planet's gravitational forces become stronger than the object's own ability to hold itself together. Up until now, the moon had been stretching, cracking, and trembling, but beyond this line, those fractures would no longer remain contained. They would begin to tear the moon apart. At first, the changes might still appear subtle from Earth. Fine lines spreading across its surface would widen into massive scars. Entire regions would begin to collapse inward as the moon's own gravity failed to keep it intact. Then, without warning, enormous sections of the lunar crust would break free. Gigantic fragments, some the size of cities, others the size of continents, would drift outward into space, forming a growing cloud of debris around the dying moon. For a brief period, the sky would become something no human had ever witnessed. Instead of a single moon, Earth would be surrounded by a fractured halo of glowing rock, dust, and ice. These fragments would reflect sunlight in chaotic patterns, turning the sky into a shifting, glittering storm. It might even look beautiful for a moment, but that beauty would be an illusion, because gravity would quickly begin pulling those fragments toward Earth. The first pieces to arrive would be smaller debris. Pebbles, rocks, and chunks of lunar material would enter the atmosphere at incredible speeds, igniting instantly. The sky would fill with streaks of fire, far denser and more continuous than any meteor shower in history. Nights would disappear completely as the heavens burned without pause. At first, many of these fragments would burn up before reaching the ground. But not all of them. Within days, larger impacts would begin. Massive rocks would punch through the atmosphere, striking the surface with explosive force. Cities, forests, mountains, and oceans would all become targets. Each impact would release energy comparable to nuclear weapons, creating shockwaves that flattened everything in their path. Fires would spread uncontrollably, merging into vast firestorms that consumed entire regions. And still, this would not be the worst of it. Because the largest fragments, the true remains of the moon, would still be falling. As the 10th month arrived, one of these colossal pieces would enter Earth's atmosphere. Unlike smaller debris, it would not burn away. It would survive the descent, glowing red-hot, as it tore through the sky. The sound alone would be unlike anything ever recorded, a continuous thunder that rolled across the planet. Then it would strike. The impact would be beyond anything humanity could comprehend. The ground itself would liquefy at the point of contact. A shockwave would travel outward at supersonic speed, flattening everything for hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. The atmosphere would ignite, sending walls of heat racing across continents. If the impact occurred in the ocean, and statistically it likely would, the result would be even more catastrophic. Water would be displaced instantly, creating mega tsunamis kilometers high. These waves would race across the globe, erasing coastlines entirely, drowning anything that had somehow survived until this point. The sky would darken as debris filled the atmosphere. Ash, dust, and vaporized material would block out the sun, plunging the planet into a global twilight. Temperatures would drop rapidly. Photosynthesis would collapse. Whatever life remained would now face a new enemy, a world without light. In the final weeks, Earth would no longer resemble the planet humanity once knew. Continents would be scarred, oceans poisoned, skies darkened, and ecosystems shattered. The remaining fragments of the moon would continue to fall, each impact of pushing the planet closer to complete collapse. And then, finally, the largest remnant would arrive. What remained of the moon, broken core, would descend toward Earth in a slow, unstoppable fall. There would be no escaping it, no surviving it. The sky would be filled entirely by its presence, a massive, fractured world crashing down upon the one that had once been its partner. The final impact would not just end civilizations, it would reset the planet. Oceans would boil, the crust would fracture, the atmosphere itself could be stripped away in places. For a moment, Earth would become a world of fire. And then, silence. And if you are still here, still watching until this final moment, then take a second and really think about what we just witnessed. Not just the destruction of a planet, but the slow unraveling of everything humanity ever built. Every city, every memory, every story, all erased. Not in an instant, but step by step, while people could only watch it coming. And maybe that is the most terrifying part, because this was not a sudden end, it was a countdown. A full year where the sky itself kept changing, and yet there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it. So now I want to ask you something. If you knew this was coming, if humanity had just 1 year left, what would you do? Would you try to survive at any cost? Would you run and hide? Or would you spend your final days with the people who actually matter most to you? Tell me in the comments, I genuinely want to know your answer. And if you enjoyed stories that make you question reality, science, and our place in the universe, then make sure you subscribe, because the next story might be even more terrifying than this one. Until then, just look up at the sky. And remember, sometimes the most beautiful things in the universe are also the most dangerous.